Hello, everybody. Hello. So let's begin. So thank you all very much for coming to this event. So we're really glad to have you here, and also have our two guest speakers. So if you're not familiar with Brooklyn for Peace, please sign up for our email list and also check out our website. We've been working in Brooklyn since 1984 on issues related to militarism and the prevention of war, and connecting different issues in ways, but the common theme is militarism, how that impacts on our whole culture, economy, and so forth. So we, of course, have become very alarmed recently about the prospect of a hot war with North Korea. But the issue of Korea has once been going on for quite a long time. Okay. And we felt that we really need to inform ourselves more about the background of it, as well as to talk about it. So we have two guests from the peace movement in South Korea and from the Korean American peace movement. And we're hoping that this event will help us to forge stronger connections with both of those movements. So I'll introduce them both, and then they'll speak in turn, and we'll have time for questions and answers afterwards. So Luke Lee is an activist and media artist for Yeonju Chol for Korean Community Development, which is an organization that's been active in Brooklyn and in Queens for many years. They do a lot of social justice work as well as educational and outreach work. Currently working with Yeonju Chol, Luke helps to coordinate the Oral History Project, which brings together Koreans across generations to share people's experiences of Korean history from the Korean War to the 1980 Gwangju People's Uprising for Democracy in South Korea, using both art and storytelling. Luke also does work for Zoom in Korea, an online resource that progressive-minded individuals and groups interested in Korean issues, as well as other U.S.-based media, can access the timely updates on major news stories related to Korea, along with critical analyses that are often lacking in the mainstream media coverage of the Korean news network. It's really a great website. I checked it out for you today, and there's a lot of really great information on it, so hopefully you can all stay in touch with us. Our second guest is Jo Yak-go, who is a musician and has been a South Korean peace activist for 20 years. Currently, he is in the U.S. to participate in the Global Network's 2017 Maine Peace Walk for conversion, community, and climate. He lived in a small village in Pyeongtaek and was engaged in a fight against the expansion of Camp Humphreys, the biggest U.S. Army garrison in Asia. Now his work focuses on conserving marine life and shutting down the Jeju naval base for demilitarization of the region and to bring peace in Northeast Asia. He has also been involved in the struggle against the THAAD, the Terminal High Area Altitude Defense, Missile Defense System, as it's called. So please join me in welcoming Luke Lee and Jo Yak-go, and we'll have Luke speaking first.
Thank you for having me here to speak to you all. And you'll have to excuse me, I caught a bit of a cold, so I'll do my best to keep consistent and bring you some informative analysis around U.S. militarism in Korea. So I wanted to begin by giving you a little bit of the history. This history, though, I think it would be very basic due to time. I think there's a lot more that we can certainly get into. But for today, I'll just get into some of the surface level basics. And I'll talk about how different forms of U.S. militarism has led to the current situation now, in which, as Charlotte mentioned, there is prospects for this potential for a hot war, one that involves nuclear weapons. And I'm sure you've all been seeing the news, just how dangerous of a situation it is, and why peace at this moment is needed more so than ever. So I'll get into some of the basics of the U.S. intervention in Korea dating back to 1945. And then I will also talk about, part of the goal for me today is also to try to debunk some of the myths that exist in the U.S. public around U.S., North Korea, or DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the tensions that have been continually rising. The reason why I wanted to try to debunk some of those myths was to complicate the issue, that it's not as simple as the mainstream media puts it. It's not crazy, evil North Korean regime versus that's threatening to attack and destroy the benevolent, righteous South Korea that's being protected by the U.S. There's a lot more going on, and in fact, in our view, the U.S. has a lot of culpability in all this, in provoking the war tensions that exist today. So the three myths in particular that I wanted to get at are the following. So there's this notion, and Trump has been saying this a lot in the media, diplomacy will never work with North Korea. It never has worked. So that's one sort of myth that I would like to look more closely at. The second one is the fact that North Korea is the greatest threat to the region. I will talk more about this, but in some ways one could argue that the U.S. Could be an even greater threat to the region. And the third is that the U.S. military is there to protect its allies, whether it's South Korea, Japan, that the U.S. is there to protect the allies of the region from North Korea, China. So just getting to the really brief history, and I know that this is very crude, like a very crude version of the history, so if you, I hope that you can go deeper into it after this presentation. But so dating back to 1945, we all know World War II had ended. But around that time, in August of 1945, the Korean people, they also liberated themselves from the colonization by the Japanese Empire. And that was around the time the U.S. also dropped nuclear bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But following Japan's surrender, what's often not talked about is the fact that the U.S. arrived in Korea, as did Soviet Union, to divide the country into two pieces of land that they can occupy. The southern portion was occupied by the U.S., and the northern Soviet forces remained for a period of time. In the south, the U.S. established a military government, soon to be followed by decades of military dictatorships that were endorsed by the U.S. government. And one thing that I'll just quickly mention without getting too much into it is that there were efforts by Koreans on both sides since around 1945, in which the people who were invested in the independence movement, the leaders, they were also invested at that point in trying to carry out reunification for themselves that wouldn't rely on foreign forces, particularly the U.S. But they weren't able to succeed because the U.S. was playing a huge role in sabotaging a lot of those movements for liberation and reunification. And I don't know if Choi Yak-wol will talk about this history at all, but moments like in 1948, the Jeju massacre, the Jeju uprising that led to a massacre, that a lot of that, there's a lot of evidence that point to the U.S. backing the South Korean police and military in causing all that violence. And just skipping ahead a little bit, 1950, I'm sure you all know the outbreak of the Korean War, June 25th. The fighting lasted around 3 years, and an armistice was agreed upon to put the war on pause, basically. The armistice agreement outlined a plan for the withdrawal of all foreign troops. Specifically, within 3 months, they were supposed to withdraw, and a peace process was to be established. But after 90 days, there was no process for a peace treaty. And although the Soviet and Chinese troops left North Korea eventually, the U.S. forces remained, and still remain to this day. There are, I don't know if the figures are exact right now, there's 28,500 troops, U.S. troops stationed in South Korea. There might be more actually in recent years. And despite this, the vestiges of war still present in the form of U.S. troops and military assets in Korea, Americans still refer to the Korean War as the Forgotten War. So why is that significant? In the minds of folks at Nolutor, the significance of the fact that it's referred to as the Forgotten War is it erases the history of total devastation and genocide that the U.S. military was in large part culpable for between 1958 and 1953. And because Americans have erased this history, political figures like Trump can easily say that the U.S. will bring total annihilation to North Korea and bring fire and fury like never seen before. But in fact, Koreans, especially North Koreans, have seen that fire and fury before. They've experienced that, and it's a part of their memory, and it is part of their daily lives, in fact. And we know that 90% of North Korea was destroyed by the U.S. carpet bombings. Many South Koreans were also affected by those bombings because many times the U.S. indiscriminately bombed people during the war. And as a result, 4 million people died. And to just give you an idea, in relation to other wars around that time, there were 635,000 tons of bombs dropped on North Korea, while there were not quite as much, still a lot, 503,000 tons in the Asia Pacific during World War II. So that gives you a perspective about the scale of the war, despite the fact that history remembers it as forgotten war, or in some cases I've heard people say, it was like a police action, right? Just going into a little bit more of the history that beyond the Korean War, the media often talks about North Korea as the nuclear threat. But what we often don't mention is that historically, the U.S. was a nuclear threat in the region long before North Korea was. After the armistice, the U.S. for decades installed hundreds of nuclear weapons in the South, and the U.S. admitted to it, in fact, in 1991 when they had removed a lot of their nuclear assets. I think there are some that are actually still there, or they have returned. Most recently, the USS Ronald Reagan, which is a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, was deployed over there as a show of force to North Korea, saying, we're ready to fight. But meanwhile, North Korea developed rapidly its economy and military, knowing that the threat of U.S. invasion was always imminent. And they did do nuclear research and development, but for them it was a way of deterrence. And it was a way to defend their sovereignty against the potential nuclear military attacks by the U.S. So now going into the three myths. The first myth being that diplomacy does not work with North Korea. The U.S. and North Korea had the potential of working out. In 1985, North Korea agreed to join the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT. And the NPT essentially says that the 5 nuclear weapon states, which were the countries that already possessed nuclear weapons, when this treaty was first signed in 1968, so the US, United Kingdom, France, China, and Russia, that they will reduce their nuclear arsenal, and all other countries agree not to develop nuclear weapons. North Korea joined the NPT in 1985, and by joining the NPT, North Korea was required to be under the scrutiny of the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, and inspections by the IAEA led it to believe at some point that North Korea was developing plutonium nuclear reactors for the purposes of developing nuclear weapons. And so they were specifically looking at this power plant called Yongbyon power plant. And North Korea claimed, though, that they had this small 5-megawatt reactor in Yongbyon, and it was an experimental reactor that was meant for civilian purposes to generate energy and electricity. But the IAEA refused to believe North Korea, and they went to the UN so that the UN could condemn North Korea. And this was the beginning of the so-called nuclear crisis in Korea. And it eventually, because of the fact that the IAEA and the UN were condemning North Korea, not believing their intention behind these nuclear reactors, North Korea withdrew from the NPT. And in response to that, the Clinton administration, particularly William Perry, who was the Secretary of Defense at the time, and Ashton Carter, who was the former Defense Secretary during Obama, they were designated to develop a plan for preemptive strike on Yongbyon. But luckily, former President Jimmy Carter was, he kind of stepped up and went to Pyongyang without the consent of Clinton at the time, and met with the then leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung. And in a brief time, they were able to arrive at an agreement. So that's Carter and Kim Il-sung meeting. So they came up with this agreed framework of 1994, which stipulated that North Korea give up its nuclear reactor in Yongbyon. It would freeze the program, and they would re-enter the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and as well as allow continued inspection of any possible nuclear program. But in return, the U.S. would have to provide 2 light water reactors, which presumably had less likelihood of producing nuclear spent fuel, which is the fuel that's used for developing weapons. As well as the U.S. would provide oil reserves for a period of time so that it can cover for the fact that the North Korean people would lose electricity by closing the Yongbyon power plant. And possibly the most important part of the agreement was also that they would be talking towards normalizing relations between the U.S. and North Korea. The U.S., I think there were other moments that followed, such as North Korea sent one of its highest level military officers, Cho Myung-ro, to Washington. They met, they produced what was called the Joint Communique, which was a mutual agreement for no hostility between the two countries. And then shortly after, Madeleine Albright visited Pyongyang, visited then leader, the son of Kim Il-sung, and the father of Kim Jong-un, was the leader now, Kim Jong-il. And so it was building up to something. But unfortunately, this was also at a time when It was towards the end of Clinton's election, or term as president, and the election between Gore and Bush was happening, so it didn't quite reach the point that the people involved in were hoping that it would reach. So once Bush came into office, the agreed framework and all that basically became nullified. And especially the U.S. on the U.S. part, they didn't deliver on a lot of the deals that it made in the negotiation. Also, what the U.S. media doesn't talk about is the fact that North Korea and South Korea were, by 2000, in talks with each other about possibilities of reunification. There was a historic summit between the leaders of the two countries, Kim Dae-jung from South Korea, Kim Jong-il from North Korea, and that's the actual document of the statement that was released by the two countries, two states. And part of the significant part of that statement was that both the North and South sides would agree to resolve the question of reunification independently without the aid of the U.S. or any other foreign power, but through the joint efforts of the Korean people. And there were moments from 2000 to about 2000, early 2000s, where the North and South Korean people were actually coming together, talking about real possibilities for reunification. But the U.S., as I was saying earlier, with the Clinton administration, it culminated into something, and then once Bush came in, the peace talks fell through. That happened on multiple occasions. Even in the Bush era, there were opportunities for peace talks, but when Obama came in, there wasn't any continuity that would be transferred over to the next administration. And a lot of times, and this is specifically referring to the Obama administration, the U.S. attitude towards North Korea was that we'll kind of keep them at bay and see what will happen. We'll pressure them with sanctions. We'll pressure them to freeze their program, but eventually, internally, North Korea will collapse. Well, all these decades later, North Korea has not collapsed. So this approach clearly is not working. The second myth I wanted to get into has to do with the fact that North Korea is the greatest threat to the Northeast Asian region. The U.S. holds the largest scale military exercises with South Korea, and sometimes with Japan as well. Largest, I think, in the world. And they do it multiple times a year. Most recently, they actually held drills off the coast of Busan, where, as I mentioned before, the USS Ronald Reagan, which is a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, as well as other strategic nuclear assets like the F-22, P-1B bombers, they were holding drills, rehearsing or simulating a preemptive strike against North Korea. There are two large-scale military exercises that are held every year, which are the Key Resolve Full Eagle and the Ochi Freedom Guardian. And those aren't really talked about in the U.S. media. So this is an image of I think P-1B bombers that are dropping dummy munitions. And that's the USS Ronald Reagan. During Obama's administration, the policy towards North Korea was strategic patience. And what that meant was that the U.S. would apply pressure through economic sanctions to isolate and deprive North Korea of nuclear or economic development, and then ratcheting up the pressure on the military side by holding those joint U.S.-South Korea exercises, which really simulated the invasion and what's called the decapitation of North Korea's leaders through surgical nuclear strikes. The third myth I wanted to get into was around this claim that the U.S. is there to protect South Korea and other allies in the region from any attack by North Korea. Currently, there are dozens of U.S. bases, and I think Joab will actually talk more about bases in his presentation, so I'll kind of skim through a little bit. But there are dozens of U.S. bases in South Korea, and they have been responsible in many ways for causing different kinds of violence and destruction for locals in South Korea. One way is how they have displaced so many communities from their homes. And so I wanted to show you just a short video of a community of folks currently living in Kunsan, where there is a U.S. air base. And I'll just play the video for you.
소음이 여기 비행기 때문에 얼마나 시끄러운지.
겁나게 남창인 사람이 한 70%예요. 나머지 남자가 귀가 울고 시끄러워서 한 적이 먹었어요. 정말 땅이마야 미국 땅이 미국 땅. 인수사 대회가 미국 캘리포니아주 주 편지를 캘리포니아주로 빼야 이러는 거야. 얘가 2주째 다 빼앗아요. 앞으로 한 년 내내 거의 다 빼앗아요.
미리 일어나고.
그만큼 나오죠.
그러나 지금 제일 남은 사람들은 아직이야 못 간 사람들, 좀 남은 사람들이 못 간 사람들도 첫 번부터 간 사람들은 한 7, 8년 있으면 이렇게 인간가
이 사람들 가셔야 돼서 고향에서 나가셔야 돼서 슬프지 않냐고.
왜? 그냥 나가서 지금 왜 여기는 지금 이렇게 나오니까는 원래 어촌이었고 이분들이 지금 고향을 옮길 수밖에 없는 상황이 된 것은 1986년도에 하나포 안전거리라는 곳이 생겼어요. 2000년대 초반에 정확히 우리 초반에 그 건지를 했어요. 하나포 안전거리라는 법이 있으니까 집을 다 비워야 된다고. 사실은 사람들이 살고 있으니까 그 법이 있는데도 기재 안에다 큰업을 만드는 것 자체가 굉장히 잘못된 행동인데 기재 안에서 발생된 일이라서 주민들이 서울 수밖에 없고 그런 부분이 있는 겁니다.
지금 이해먹고 나온 사람이가 국가에 너란대로 오니까 안 간다는 게 쫓아버리는 게 좋은 것 같아. 다 쫓아버려. 그리고 뭐라고 이름이 하니 한국 사람이 국가를 대통령이 전부 병들이라고 치워버리는데 처음에 아파야 오니까 전부 감기쳐버리는
So that was actually some footage that was captured by a delegation of Veterans for Peace, and they were visiting last year, 2016, in the summer, different U.S. bases and taking a look at how the bases have affected the livelihood of surrounding communities. So clearly, the U.S. military base in this instance physically displaces people, and because it takes over the land of South Korea. Another way that another way that U.S. military bases have caused harm is through environmental damage. So this is an image of South Korean activists demanding that the United States forces Korea, the U.S. forces that are stationed in Korea, take responsibility for the oil spills that have come from the military bases. I believe, so Yongsan Garrison, which is the headquarters of the United States Forces Korea, the measured level of contamination outside Yongsan now stands at well over 8,000 times the Korean government safety standard. And it can only be presumed that the situation inside the base is substantially worse. And this is taken from an article by Gregory Yevich, who writes a lot about Korea. So there's a movement just around demanding accountability from the U.S. for the environmental damage that it has caused. And then this is a video that also talks a little bit about the status of forces agreement, which basically legitimizes the U.S. military presence and protects the United States forces from being held accountable for the violence that it has perpetrated, whether it is in the form of environmental destruction or displacement of the people from their homes and communities. SOFA is something, so a lot of South Korean activists have been for many years demanding that the terms of the SOFA be changed so that there is more accountability from the U.S. soldiers. Here's another video from the Kunsan Air Base.
여기도 지금 미군 기지가, 이 미군 기지는 현재 미군에게 배타적 사용권, 그냥 전용 사용, 모든 행정권과 권리를 다 주어주는 사용권을 주어졌기 때문에 그리고 무상으로 이제 사용하고 있다. 근데 이것을 또 유지하고 관리하는데 드는 비용을 한국이 방위비 분담금이라는 걸로 1년에 올해는 9,300억 원.
9,300억 원.
어쨌든 지금 공군 같은 경우는 거의 미군이 주도하고 있고 그 밑에 한국이 존재하는 그림에 현재 태평양 사람의 그림이 그렇게 그려져 있는 것 같다. 여기 굉장히 주민하고 기자들 매우 가깝게 살고 있는데 여기 주변에 사는 사람들을 많은 고통을 겪게 받고 있다.
About environmental pollution. 환경 문제는 기본적으로 괜히 소음이
Noise over across is the biggest problem.
그 다음에 기름이 유출된 사고가 2011년까지
Until 2011, we had oil spill problem reported.
Usually at air bases they have a large problem with oil and gasoline contamination of the water, and often they don't ever report it until the base closes, and then when they go in to do something with the base, that's when they discover that there are major problems.
이 안에서 근무하는 계단들에게 어떤 식으로 오염되어 있는지 그리고 전에 어떻게 기지가 운영되었는지를 계속 리포팅을 하고 있어요.
So we intend to publish a report.
아니 발표해도 아직 소파 때문에 아무 의미가 없어. 조사권이 없기 때문에.
Okay.
The status of forces agreement is it basically allows the U.S. to do anything, and there's no punishment for it.
Exactly.
소파가 어쨌든 주둔군에게 지위를 어떻게 주느냐를 가지고 결정하는 건데 그 주둔군에 대한 그 국가의 사고관이 반영되어 있는 것이 소파라고 생각하는데 한국의 소파라고 하나의 국가로서 대한민국이 제대로 자림하고 있다라면은 이 소파는 국가가 이쪽 주둔하고 있는 미군을 바라보는 시각을 반영해야 되는데 그렇지 못하고 있는 것이 현실이고 그리고 만약에 그것을 반영해야 된다고 생각하면 계속적인 소파 개정을 얘기해야 되고 우리도 1년에 한 번 정도는 계속 소파에 대한 내용들을 국회는 입법제다 이런 거 계속 건의를 하고 있는데 한국 지금 2002년인가 개정 이후에 한 번도 안 되고 있는 거죠. 이게 필요 악처럼 존재를 하고 있고 그리고 뭔가 우리가 이렇게
Another way the U.S. military has perpetrated violence is through the violence against women. So in this image, there are activists calling for accountability for U.S. soldiers who were involved in sexual violence against a high school student. And again, the SOFA agreement, the SOFA protects U.S. military personnel from being held accountable, being put through the court system, the legal system in South Korea, and they're handed over basically to the U.S., who most times don't do much about it. And we know that the Korea Truth Commission in 2003, they released from their research findings that included the fact that the U.S. military had committed gross and systematic violence against women, both in northern and southern parts of Korea, from 1945 to 2001. And I'm sure there's many cases ever since then. And many of those many of the acts are characterized as mass rapes, sexual assaults, murders. And so I think I've kind of gone a little bit over, so I'm going to try to go quickly through just introducing the THAAD system. So THAAD standing for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. This is the most recent manifestation of U.S. military making its presence known in South Korea. THAAD, one of the arguments against that is the fact that why is it there? It doesn't seem to be serving the purpose of defending South Korea against North Korean nuclear missiles. Because if North Korea were to attack South Korea with missiles, they would use short-range, low-altitude missiles, or missiles that would fly short-range, low-altitude, that would be beyond the range of the THAAD, which is for high-altitude missiles at the terminal phase. And it's not even used to, it wouldn't be effective against missiles aimed at military assets in Japan or Guam. Not to get into the technical details, just for the sake of time, but politically and technically it would be very difficult for the THAAD to defend against the missiles that are aimed towards there. So what could it be used for? That's still a question. Some experts speculate that because of the radar that's attached to the missile defense system, that it will be able to acquire information about missile activity in the region, whether it's North Korea or China even, and relay that information to other missile defense systems that are installed all around the world. There's missile defense systems in Europe, missile defense systems in different parts of Asia. And so basically the U.S. has been building this network of missile defense systems to acquire not only information but also a strategic advantage against other nuclear states, whether it's China or Russia. Sorry, I can't get into much more of the details around that. And despite the fact that it doesn't seem to be useful to the South Korean people, they're the ones that are going to be that are responsible for paying the cost of the THAAD system, as well as they're the ones that will be experiencing the negative impact of for the local residents of living near that system. The radar is supposed to release radioactive waves that can be harmful to the health of the people around the region. And it will add to the the seemingly endless global arms race between the U.S. with North Korea, with China. For China, their concern is that U.S. is basically surveilling their military assets. For Russia, they already have missile defense that are installed around its region, and so having more from the other side, that it only envelops Russia in this U.S. network of missile defense system. And one thing to note is that this was not a decision that was approved by the South Korean people. It was a decision made by the U.S. government, the U.S. military, and the South Korean government, which was at the time the former President Park Geun-hye. She was being investigated for a corruption scandal. So that tells you that despite South Korea being at being in a turmoil, in a political turmoil, that the U.S. and the South Korean government were able to push this system through without any democratic process whatsoever. And the people of Seongju, which is the county where that missile defense system has been deployed already, since 2016, they held daily protests. Many of the people who have been protesting are small. They're farmers. They're elderly, and many of them were actually conservative until this happened. They voted for the previous conservative president, but then they felt betrayed by the fact that the South Korean government and the U.S. would push this thing forward. And so they would hold daily protests. So these are some of the images. In Korea, shaving your head in protest is a huge symbolic gesture that really says that I'm willing to put my body on the line to defend what's right for us. Religious figures became involved, particularly the Hwang Buddhists. They were at the forefront of defending against the THAAD system. Again, a lot of the elderly folks, they were on the front lines, putting their bodies on the line, trying to stop the U.S. and South Korean government from pushing the military equipment through. And unfortunately, in April of this year and September of this year, they were able to bring the parts in. And at this point, the deployment of the system has been completed, but they're still fighting. I think I've run out of time, so I won't be able to show this video, but you can check out videos around the struggle against the THAAD system online on YouTube. If you search for Zoom in Korea, that's one way you can access some of the videos. Or if you visit the site zoominkorea.org, that you'll be able to see other articles around the U.S. DPRK tensions, as well as the THAAD struggle and other progressive Korean movements, labor movements that are happening in Korea. So I'm sorry for going a little bit over, but thank you for your time.
Nice to meet you, everyone. Thanks for having me here. My name is Jo Yak-ol, and I'm from South Korea. I'm a career peace activist for 20 years, and I've been resisting peacefully against U.S. military bases in South Korea and militarism and militarization of the country. The peace movement in South Korea has been strong, but the U.S. military was stronger. It was stronger than the people of South Korea. Let me tell you some stories. In 2002, 2 middle school girls were crushed to death by U.S. armored vehicles during a small military drill, and those soldiers who were driving the armored vehicle was not even put to trial. People died during the U.S. military exercise, but those who were responsible did not even get punished. You think it was at least manslaughter, negligence, but they got away with murder. And the U.S. and South Korea military joint exercises take place several times a year, every year, in March, in August, in October, but in like small scale, those military exercises take place almost everywhere at any time, and most Korean people don't know about it because it's not covered in the media. But those people who live near those military bases know it very well because of the noise, because of the bullets, because of the effects on their community. You know how many U.S. military bases are there in South Korea? Can you take a guess? 200. 800 in South Korea. There are U.S. military bases.
800?
It's less than that. You know, there are about 800 overseas U.S. military bases in 173 countries. In South Korea alone. You know, when I first started peace movement, we were told that there were about 200 U.S. military bases scattered in South Korea. Right now, the number shrunk to about 83. So there are 83 U.S. military bases in South Korea, which are located on strategically important places, like big cities. You have Bunsan Air Base, you have Osan Air Base, you have Daegu Air Base, you have Yongsan, the headquarters of U.S. forces in South Korea, which moved to Pyeongtaek. And this Camp Humphreys is the biggest U.S. Army garrison in Asia, but someone say it's the biggest one in the whole world. Well, it says the size is about 3,500 acres. I don't know how big that is, but I saw how big it is with my own eyes. I was there when the U.S. military and South Korean government announced a plan to move the U.S. headquarters and all the soldiers stationed near the border between North Korea and South Korea to the southern area, avoiding the direct missile attacks from North Korea. And now the headquarters is located in Pyeongtaek area, about 1 hour drive from Seoul. The farmers who were living around Camp Humphreys, they were forcibly removed from their homes. All of a sudden they were told that they had to leave their community, that they had been living for so long. Why? Because of national security, because of the United States' new military policies. Before that time, the U.S. troops in South Korea stayed there. They didn't go any other warfield. But during that time, after U.S. invasion to Iraq, U.S. felt the necessity to move its troops for the theaters. And so they coined the term strategic flexibility. And it meant that U.S. troops in South Korea could move to Afghanistan. They could send them to Iraq or anywhere else according to the U.S. military plan. And so that was the reason why they moved the headquarters and other foot soldiers to Camp Humphreys. And it's close to the west coast of South Korea, which is facing China. So that expansion of U.S. military base, Camp Humphreys, was a huge issue in South Korea from 2004 till 2007. A lot of people, including myself, went down to the small village of 5,500 residents, beautiful village, to defend it from the expansion. We couldn't succeed in defending the village, and now the villagers, the residents, were all separated, and the rice paddies turned to be airfield where U.S. flights, warships, planes, fighter jets, and helicopters carrying special operation units for its region, and it's heartbroken to see that. The farmers used to grow rice in their field, and now it's used for war. U.S. has a very strong military presence in South Korea, and in terms of military, we can say the U.S. is controlling South Korea. With its 30,000 troops and strategic assets, B-1B bombers, B-2 bombers, B-52 bombers, aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, Aegis destroyers. It's all in Korea. The U.S. is constantly sending its weapons and soldiers and threats to Korea. And on top of that, Donald Trump is making those remarks that we will totally destroy North Korea. People like me, when we heard Donald Trump making that kind of remarks, it means death for me. Why? Because if you totally destroy North Korea, South Korea will be totally destroyed too, because you cannot separate it. It's on the Korean peninsula. So when he says fire and fury, it means I can be under the fire and fury of the United States. If the U.S. is attacking North Korea, just like all options on the table, then may escalate into a full-scale war, and within 24 hours, tens of thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people will be killed. Within 3 days, within 5 days, millions of people will die. Just like the Korean War. 4 million your relatives, the Korean War survivors, my grandparents, they say 6 million people died. So Korean people all have relatives of war survivors, and they say no matter what happens, war is not a solution. We have to do everything and anything to stop any kind of military actions on the Korean Peninsula. That's what Korean people are saying. That's what we want to say to Donald Trump administration, that military option should not be on the table. And that's what people of Seongju saying to the U.S. That's what people of Jeju are saying to the U.S. After the Pyeongtaek struggle, I moved down to Jeju Island, where South Korean government announced a plan to build a Navy base. Traditionally, in South Korea, there are many U.S. Army and Air Force. Now, all of a sudden, in 2007, Korean government said, okay, we need a new gigantic Navy base on this beautiful island of Jeju. Nobody understood. We don't need a Navy base. We already have many naval bases in Busan, in Jinhae, in Mokpo, in Pyeongtaek, in Donghae. We have like 5 gigantic naval bases already. Why do we need another one? The Korean government said, oh, the threat from North Korea is increasing, so we need another Navy base. On Jeju Island, do you know where Jeju Island is? If you see a map, then you will understand what I'm saying. Jeju Island is the most distant island from North Korea. So there is no point to make a military base to deter North Korean attack or threat. So we thought that it was going to be used by the U.S. Navy, and it's right. You know what is happening on Jeju Naval Base right now? There was a massive U.S. and South Korean navies joint military drills on the east coast and the west coast of Korea, which ended about a week ago. Some 40 warships participated in the joint Navy drills, and when it was over, all those warships, those battleships, where did they go? Those naval bases in South Korea, including Jeju Navy Base. So we have one Aegis destroyer, USS Mustin is the name. It's in port of Jeju Naval Base. The people of Jeju Naval Base, the people of Jeju Island, have fighting against the construction of the Jeju Navy Base for 10 years now. The construction was finished last year, but the people of Jeju did not stop fighting against it because it increases the tension in the region, and as U.S. warships. Have you heard of USS Zumwalt? That's most advanced combat vessel, next generation, armed with all the weapons, and it's a scary battleship because on the enemy radar it looks like a very small fishing vessel. But as a matter of fact, it's huge. I saw it myself 2 weeks ago. I participated in Maine Peace Walk, and this shipyard called Bath Iron Works, run by General Dynamics. They make all different kind of Aegis destroyers, and some of the U.S.-made Aegis destroyers come to South Korea, including Jeju Navy base. And so that is why the people of Jeju are still fighting against this naval base. And it will put Jeju Island in the front line of U.S. outposts against China's expansion, because what the U.S. military is doing in Northeast Asia is to check China's expansion, maintaining its dominance, stopping China's oil imports, and so it is increasing threats in the region, and the people on the island of Jeju are feeling every day, because they have never seen U.S. soldiers on the island anymore, but now they can see them walking around in their community. And every day, people on this small village where the new naval base was completed, we do peace action at the main gate of the Navy base. And every day we sing and dance, because the people believe that one day the power of peace can close down this Navy base, and we can recover this sacred rock which was destroyed by the construction of Jeju Naval Base. Jeju people believe the rock is still alive, even though the surface of the rock was destroyed, blasted by dynamite, by Samsung, by Korean government. It is still alive, and so that is what the people of Gangjong Village on Jeju Island continue what we have been doing for the past 10 years to preserve this pristine ecosystem of the island. Dolphins used to live there. And now, after the Jeju Naval Base construction is completed, they're all gone. So that's why I made this group, Hopping Dolphins, to preserve marine life there. And so, at the same time, we are fighting against the militarization of the island. We are trying to conserve the endangered species on the sea. And like I said, every day we sing and dance in front of the Jeju Naval Base. And let me share some of the songs that we sing at the base. Just like Songju people who fought against the deployment of THAAD missile systems, the Jeju people have been fighting against this military base in a non-violent way. The protest and resistance has been peaceful. In doing so, numerous people have been arrested and put into jail, including myself. We had to pay $3 million in fine 600 people were prosecuted, charged, and convicted. And now, what the South Korean Navy is doing to the villagers and peace activists is making us pay more because of our peaceful resistance. The completion of the Jeju Navy base delayed. We have to pay the damage. And so they recently filed a lawsuit against 120 people. And the amount of money that we have to pay, should we lose the lawsuit, is more than 30 million US dollars. Each of us have to pay about $100,000, and I don't have that much money. So what I did instead is to make this song. I made this song about 1 year ago when the Navy's damage lawsuit began, and I've been singing this one almost every day. And now we have the new president. Maybe he's going to drop the lawsuit, but we don't know yet. So let me sing this one again. This one is called Drop the Damage Lawsuit, but it's all in Korean. I don't know why it's funny.
부산권을 초래해, 부산권을 초래해, 4,5천만 원 부산권을 초래해, 제주 해군기지 반대 부산권을 초래해, 마을 다 죽이는 부산권을 초래해, 제주 국민 하나 되어 부산권을 초래해, 그것 위한 사랑 부산권을 초래해. 돈이 없는 사람도 다 함께 외쳐봐. 평화로운 제주도로 원하며 외쳐봐. 아름다운 강정마을 사랑하며 외쳐봐. 해군기지 반대하며 더욱 크게 외쳐봐. 부산권을 초래해, 부산권을 초래해, 싸우는 척만 부산권을 초래해, 제주해 반대 부산권을 초래해, 강정마을 다 죽이는 부산권을 초래해, 제주도민 하나 되는 부산권을 초래해, 무엇이나 사랑하는 부산권을 초래해. 돈이 없는 사람들 다 함께 외쳐봐. 평화로운 제주도로 원한다며 외쳐봐. 아름다운 그곳만 사랑하며 외쳐봐. 이슬람의 장수와 공원 싫어요. 노래가 뛰어노는 바다가 좋아요. 부산권을 초래해요. 부산권을 초래해. 34억을 청하는 부산권을 초래해. 제주 해군기지한테 부산권을 초래해. 강정마을 다 죽이는 부산권을 초래해. 시민 하나 되어 부산권을 초래해. 누구야 사랑의 부산권을 초래해.
Thank you. Somehow the reception of Korean music is not that great. I'm going to sing one more song, and this song is also in Korean language, but the title is like a rock. It's a song that many activists like to sing along. You should look Great to sing with you. And the way we sing this one is singing and dancing together. So if you feel like dancing, you can stand up and dance together. Just like the Columbia rock, that's not be shaken by the wind, but let's deeply put our roots in the ground and continue our peaceful resistance.
위처럼 살아가보자. 부진 비바람이 몰아친대도 어떤 유혹의 손길에도 흔들림 없는 나위처럼 살자꾸나. 우리 모두 전화에 불안하지 않고 시련 속에 다시 배우를 쳐가며 마침내 우리 해방 세상 빛을 보이네. 나비처럼 영살 가구나. 우리 모두 전화에 불안하지 않고 시련 속에 다시 배우를 쳐가며 마침내 우리 해방 세상 빛을 보이네. 나비처럼 살자꾸나.
Thank you so much. That was really just fabulous. Really inspiring. Very much. So I feel a little bit speechless after looking at that last song. But if we have time for some questions, we maybe questions you would like to ask. Where'd you come from?
Okay, if you guys want to be heard, you have to do it.
Can I be heard like this?
Not for,
You recording this or something? You need me to
Live stream.
no, you want to be heard on live stream. Here for the.
Just two basic questions about the history. Number one, how did Korea become divided in 1945? We know that Vietnam, the defeat of the French, there was Geneva Accords, it was supposed to be reunited. The United States prevented that from happening. So number one, how did how did Korea become divided, number one? And number two, what was the basis upon which the United States supposedly withdrew its nuclear weapons in 1991?
The United States divided Korea by drawing a line in the middle, the 38th parallel. U.S. junior officer called Dean Rusk just put it in, and the United States defeated Japan together. They were the two countries that won, and Korea was, under the Japanese colonial rule, and the war is over now. What is going to do? Korean people wanted to have their independent country, but then the United States didn't want it. The Soviet Union didn't want it because they wanted to increase their influence in the region. The United States saw Korean Peninsula as a strategic place, but then the Soviet Union were very strong at the time. So they made a deal, and then the United States, okay, let's cut in half. I'm going to take the south, and you take the north. That's why Korea was divided, and still it is.
Maybe just one thing to add to that, I guess, is like Joak was saying, I think there were strategic reasons for why they chose Korea. But what to add to that, what's perplexing is the fact that when Germany was defeated in World War II, Germany was divided. Japan was also a part of the Axis powers, and for some reason they didn't choose Japan, they chose Korea to divide. So that's something to put out there as well.
If I could just ask, Kim Il-sung, North Korea, they claim that what would the Korean people have chosen without outside interference after World War II?
Let me tell you briefly about Jeju Island. Right after Korea was liberated, Jeju Islanders set up the People's Committee all over Jeju Island to govern the island by themselves. And it was very successful up until 1947. By the time the Korean mainland was divided, and Jeju people didn't like that idea, and so they did strikes, and they organized massive demonstrations in protest of this general election that was going to happen to set up South Korean government, by electing the constitution lawmakers. And Jeju people didn't like the idea, and then fought against it, and so that was the background of the so-called April 3rd massacre, where some 30,000 Jeju people were killed from 1947 till 1954, and many Jeju Islanders say much more people were killed during the April 3rd uprising and the massacre. About 660,000 people were killed, and at the time the Jeju Island population was 300,000, so more than 1/10 of the people were killed in establishing their own government, and it was foiled by the United States military, who trained Korean soldiers, who gave weapons to Korean soldiers, who gave direct orders to Korean soldiers and police. At the time, in 1947, Korean government was not fully officially established. Korean military was not officially established. It was under U.S. military control, and lots of people were killed because they wanted a sovereign state.
And then, just to add a little bit, I mentioned in my presentation that there were efforts for also reunification at the time, involving many of the leaders of the independence movement during Japanese colonization period. And in fact, one of the key leaders, Kim Woo, who was a key figure, and Kim Il-sung, they, amongst other leaders, they came together in 1948 for an inter-Korean conference to precisely discuss that issue of reunification. But then, shortly after, the U.S.-backed government of South Korea at the time, Syngman Rhee, ordered the execution or the assassination of Kim Woo, and so that also really, undermined the genuine attempts by Korean people to reunify and liberate themselves from foreign powers.
Well, thank you so much. This was very moving and informative. I wonder what you would say that people in the United States can best do in this situation to, try to, affect things in a positive way.
For example, when Jeju Islanders were fighting against the construction of the Jeju Naval Base, I believe it was sometime in 2015, Santa Rosa County in California, the county council unanimously adopted this resolution that it opposed the construction of the Jeju Naval Base. In 2014, Cork City in Ireland also adopted this resolution unanimously to oppose the construction of the Jeju Naval Base. About 2 weeks ago, we heard that Hawaii Council also unanimously passed this resolution that people of Hawaii demand Trump administration not to use any kind of military options against North Korea. The people of Hawaii demanded Trump administration that current North Korea's military crisis should be solved peacefully. It was the will of the Hawaiian people, and so it was very moving for Korean people.
Speaking, I guess, as a Korean American activist, I think one thing is to change public opinion here in the U.S., challenge the narrative of the mainstream media. This is something that I did mention because I ran out of time. Why is U.S. militarism continuing to, make its impact in the region? Well, this war is a good excuse for the military-industrial complex to continue to profit. Just the THAAD missile defense system, Raytheon, the company that supplies the radar, Lockheed Martin that supplies the interceptor missiles, they are profiting off of selling these weapons to countries like South Korea. So I think, just keep talking about what kind of an impact U.S. militarism is having on the people of Korean people, or the struggles of the Korean people, and highlighting the voices of those who are in this struggle, understanding their story, and making sure that we uplift those voices as much as we can. I think that's one thing that we can do, and actually develop the relationships, perhaps. Develop relationships with activists like Choi Ak-pol and those who are on the ground over in South Korea, and do solidarity work together.
According to a U.S. congressional report, South Korea was the biggest arms importer in the world in 2014. South Korea spent $7.8 billion in the year for importing arms, and $7 billion was from the U.S. $7 billion every year well, not every year, but South Korea is one of the biggest arms importer from the U.S., maybe top 3 next to Saudi Arabia and countries like that. And so the military tension is not going away because U.S. arms manufacturers making tons of profit by maintaining these tensions. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, General Dynamics, and they all, say to the United States military that, you are doing a great job.
I would like to ask you, what is the role in Korea of the corporations that many of us know about, like Samsung and Hyundai and so forth, which clearly have become very prominent, not only in the Korean Peninsula, but frankly in the world. And where do they stand in relation to supporting the military, having concerns about the military, or those issues?
Boycott Samsung right now. That's what you should do.
Boycott them.
One thing, it was very surprising after I visited the US 2 weeks ago. Many people are having Samsung phones. Peace activists in South Korea, they don't use Samsung anymore. Because we all know that Samsung is one of the biggest arms manufacturers in South Korea. All the largest companies in South Korea. Samsung, Hyundai, Kia. Maybe, some of you may drive Kia cars. They all, that's not Korean company. Mitsubishi, that's a Japanese company, and it's a huge weapon manufacturer. They all make artillery, guns, armored vehicles, warplanes, combat vessels. They all, support the arms race, and in doing so, they make huge profit. We all know that.
Other questions? Just let me mention, Central Lane, after seeing those pictures of the demonstrations in South Korea, one thing that we often do is call our congresspeople. It seems a little modest, but at least something that we can do. And there are two things at present we need to call about. One is to demand a freeze for a freeze. You have these flyers at the front desk, take them with you when you go. But we know that North Korea has already suspended its nuclear missile testing if the U.S. and South Korea halt their provocative nuclear drills. This is something we should all get behind to let elected representatives know that we want the U.S. to take that pathway as opposed to the path that is now going down. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that there is what's the Markey-Liu bill in Congress, which would essentially take Trump's finger off the nuclear button, but now is unfortunately there. And one thing I learned just this afternoon is that Senator Gillibrand has signed on as a co-sponsor to this bill. She did this just last week, October 17th. I didn't know that until this afternoon. So we should all call to thank Gillibrand for signing on to co-sponsor this bill, and also call Schumer to let him know that he has to sign on as well. And in the House, all of our Brooklyn representatives have signed as co-sponsors. And again, just about 2 weeks ago, Nadler signed on as a co-sponsor. And this is something that hadn't happened before. It's also very important. I didn't even know about it. So should again call Nava, especially in his district, call Nava, or getting a meeting with Nava for next week, hopefully. People should call him, let him know we really appreciate his taking an action to sign on to the bill. And otherwise, I think what was pointed out to me is again how little we know about South Korea and how little connection we've made to the South Korean and the Korean American peace movement. So I'm hoping out of this will come a further and much stronger connection. I just felt so inspired by seeing the people, the pictures of those grandmothers and grandfathers sitting down in front of those military vehicles in protecting that deployment. And I just feel like nothing like that is really happening here. And we just have both a lot to learn from and a lot of inspiration to take from what he's presented to us. So thanks again for making the trip and coming out to Brooklyn, and thank you for coming to South Korea.
You can do something that directly you can show your support to Korean people. Let's take group photos holding the banners, and then you can show your face to Korean people that we don't want the war. We don't, want to see U.S. sending its troops to increasing the tension in the region. Let's. Yeah, anyone can take a photo. I mean, it's a good way to support the Korean people. Please come out and take photos all together, holding banners. Samsung is the one who built the gigantic Jeju Navy base. All right. Come on to the stage, please. This is a banner signed by all the people from all over the world who came to Jeju Island and said no to naval base, said no to war.
Yeah, it's a village name.
Squeeze in a little bit.
Can we have more people?
If one person all the cameras and everybody else can.
Yes. Look.
The Korean government going to come after me now?
Korean CIA. Korean FBI. Well, if you don't want to be in the picture, it's okay. I'm sure KCIA people will monitor it.
Become
We're not worried.
You're not, yeah.
Nothing about us.
They know about us already.
Nothing's gonna stop us.
Can you hold this camera so that it's, take a photo with me?
It was incredible. I know so much. Most